Thomas Harding was an experienced real estate agent, known for his ability to sell difficult properties. His success came from years of hard work and a natural talent for convincing buyers. Recently, however, he had hit a rough patch. The competition in the market was brutal, and the financial pressure was starting to weigh on him. His marriage was on the brink of collapse, and the mortgage on his own house threatened to crush him. He desperately needed a big sale. One day, while reviewing some of the homes that had been stuck in his portfolio for a long time, he received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end of the line was cold and monotone, almost emotionless. The man didn't introduce himself but said he was interested in buying one of the oldest properties Thomas had been trying to sell, a huge, decrepit Victorian mansion located in the city's French Quarter. The house, locally known as the Beaumont Mansion, had a dark history. It was said to be cursed, and it had been decades since anyone had lived there. At first, Thomas was surprised by the interest, but he couldn't afford to turn it down. The buyer seemed eager, saying money was no issue. He insisted the purchase had to be quick, with no visits to the property and without too many questions. Payment would be made in cash. Despite the numerous warnings he had heard over the years about the mansion, stories of disappearances, hauntings, and unexplained tragedies, Thomas was blinded by his need to close the deal. He didn't believe in superstitions and was determined to save his career. In his mind, selling this property was the answer to all his problems. But something about the buyer's behavior unsettled Thomas. His voice was cold, but there was an underlying urgency that Thomas couldn't quite place. Throughout the entire negotiation, Thomas felt as if he was being watched, even within the safety of his own office. However, he chose to ignore that instinct. After all he needed was the sale. Without hesitation, he scheduled a meeting at the real estate office to formalize the paperwork. The buyer, however, refused to appear in person, sending a mysterious representative instead, a middle-aged man with a serious, distant expression. The man introduced himself only as Mr. Gray. The sale was completed in less than 48 hours, and the money hit Thomas's account instantly. The relief was immediate. He felt like he could finally breathe again, that his problems were solved. However, what seemed like the end of his financial woes would soon become the beginning of something far more sinister. In the weeks following the sale, Thomas began to notice strange things. He received text messages from unknown numbers with cryptic, eerie phrases like, "You should have asked about the house," and "It wasn't abandoned for no reason." The lights in his home flickered at night, and on a few occasions, he felt as though something or someone was watching him from the shadows. He tried to dismiss the paranoia, thinking it was just post-sale stress or his mind playing tricks on him. However, on one particularly quiet night, Thomas received one final message, "You're next." After the last threatening message he received, Thomas could no longer ignore the growing unease that had taken over his life. Even though the sale was completed and the payment was in his account, he felt that something was deeply wrong. During the day, he tried to stay busy with other clients and deals, but at night, when he returned to his home in a quiet New Orleans neighborhood, the feeling that something was watching him became almost unbearable. The nights grew longer. The messages stopped for a few days, but Thomas began to have disturbing dreams. In the dreams, he saw Beaumont Mansion, the house he had sold, shrouded in thick fog. He wandered through its dark corridors, hearing whispers and indistinct voices. A shadowy figure followed him, always lurking but never fully visible. When he tried to escape, the mansion's hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the house was trapping him. One day, Thomas decided to investigate. He didn't believe in curses, but he wanted to put an end to the paranoia. He searched for information about the former owners of Beaumont Mansion. In old city archives, he discovered that the house had belonged to a wealthy family in the late 19th century, the Beaumonts, who were known for their eccentricity and dark secrets. The last known resident was Marguerite Beaumont, a woman who, according to reports from the time, mysteriously disappeared in 1903 along with two of her children. The case was never solved, but local rumors claimed that Marguerite practiced occult rituals in the house and that her family was involved in something sinister. The events around him started to become even more unsettling. Strange accidents began to occur. One day, while driving to work, his brakes suddenly failed, nearly causing a serious crash. His home was no longer a safe haven either. Picture frames inexplicably fell, lights flickered without reason, and at night, he heard footsteps coming from upstairs, even though he knew he was alone. He tried to ignore the signs, but the pressure mounted day by day. His relationship with his wife, Rachel, which was already strained, began to crumble. She accused him of being obsessed with work and becoming more distant. When he finally decided to tell her about the strange messages and disturbing dreams, Rachel was alarmed. She urged him to seek help, perhaps from a therapist, suggesting that anxiety was affecting his perception of reality. However, Thomas knew something more than psychological issues was at play. He could feel the presence of that shadowy figure even when he was awake, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger. On one particularly dark and stormy night, Thomas woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of a loud noise coming from the living room. He walked downstairs, his heart pounding with every step, and saw that the front door was slightly open, even though he was certain he had locked it before going to bed. Outside, he saw a figure standing on the sidewalk, partially illuminated by the dim streetlight. The stranger wore a long dark coat, and their face was obscured by the shadow of a hat. When Thomas shouted, asking who it was, the figure remained still for a long moment before simply disappearing into the night. From that moment on, Thomas was convinced that someone was following him, perhaps the man who bought the house or the mysterious Mr. Gray. He started calling the buyer's number repeatedly, but every attempt resulted in an empty voicemail. The more he tried to solve the mystery, the more his life seemed to fall apart. Days later, the messages began again. This time, they were more frequent and threatening. "You should have asked why no one lives there," was the first message, followed by another soon after, "They want you." On the same day, Thomas visited the real estate office to ask his colleagues if anyone knew more about Mr. Gray or the mysterious buyer, but no one seemed to remember any specific details. Even the document seemed incomplete, as if the sale of the mansion had been made in a void. Then, everything got worse. One night, while reviewing documents in his office, all the lights in the house suddenly went out. Thomas, now agitated, grabbed his phone to call for help, but it slipped from his hands when he saw, through the window, a silhouette standing in the yard. It was the same figure he had seen on the sidewalk days earlier. It didn't move, just stared at him from afar. Trembling, Thomas ran outside, determined to confront it. But when he reached the yard, the figure had vanished. He felt a cold gust of wind pass by him, and for a moment, he sensed that he was no longer alone. A cold voice whispered in his ear, "You sold more than a house. You sold your soul." Desperate and with his mind on the verge of collapse, Thomas returned to Beaumont Mansion, determined to face the truth and find out what was really happening. He needed to know who had bought the house and why he was being haunted. Little did he know that crossing the rusted gate of the mansion again would change his life forever. That stormy night, Thomas Harding found himself standing in front of Beaumont Mansion once again. The massive Victorian structure, with its broken windows and ivy-covered walls, looked even more menacing under the faint light of the moon and the relentless beating of the rain. The silence around him was unsettling, broken only by the wind whistling through the ancient trees that surrounded the property. Thomas, exhausted and on edge, knew he had to confront whatever was happening. As he crossed the rusted gate, a wave of dread washed over him. The path to the front door was littered with dry leaves, and the air around him grew heavier with each step. He had no clear plan, only a desperate desire to end the terror consuming his life. With trembling hands, Thomas pushed open the mansion's door, which creaked ominously. The interior of the house was shrouded in darkness, and the smell of mold and decay filled the air. He turned on the flashlight on his phone, illuminating the vast entry hall, where old tapestries and dusty furniture told the story of a grand era long forgotten. But there was something else in the air. A presence, almost tangible, that seemed to be watching him closely. As he walked through the long, narrow corridors, Thomas began to hear distant whispers. He stopped, gripping the flashlight tightly, trying to listen. The voices were indistinct, but he could make out words like sin, betrayal, and revenge. Something was terribly wrong. He followed the sounds up to the second floor, where the Beaumont family's main room was located. Then he saw it. In the middle of the room stood a figure, its face partially obscured by darkness. Thomas recognized it immediately. It was the man who had bought the house, the same one he had seen in his nightmares and in the shadows of his own life. The figure, tall and imposing, wore the same black coat and hat as the mysterious man who had been stalking him. But there was more. The air around him seemed to ripple, as if reality itself was distorted by his presence. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The man stepped forward, revealing part of his face, pale, with dark, empty eyes, as if there was no life behind them. "You should never have sold this house," the man said, his voice echoing as if from a faraway place. "Now, they're coming for you." Confused and terrified, Thomas asked who they were. But before the man could answer, the door behind Thomas slammed shut, locking him inside the room. The whispers grew louder, now echoing off the walls. The air turned colder, and the light from his phone began to flicker until it went out completely. Thomas was alone in the dark, with the entity he now knew wasn't human. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the wall, and Thomas felt the floor tremble beneath his feet. He looked ahead and saw an old door, which had previously blended into the decor, slowly creak open. A faint, reddish light came from within, revealing a staircase that led down to a basement he didn't know existed. Against all his instincts, Thomas knew he had to go down. Something was calling him. He began to descend the wooden steps, each one more hesitant than the last. The air grew thick, smelling of damp earth and rot. The voices that had once been distant now sounded directly in his ears, as if they were surrounding him. "She's waiting," they said. "She never left." At the bottom of the stairs, Thomas found a large, suffocating room, with old candelabras barely lighting the space. In the center of the basement was an ancient altar, etched with symbols he didn't recognize. On top of the altar was an old black and white photograph of the Beaumont family, Marguerite Beaumont and her children. Their eyes in the photo seemed fixed on Thomas, as if watching him even after more than a century. But what truly horrified him was what he saw next. Around the altar, translucent figures began to take shape. They were the souls of the Beaumont family, their bodies semi-transparent and twisted in pain. Their hollow eyes seemed to beg for something, for some kind of release. Marguerite Beaumont stood among them, her features etched with the agony of an eternity trapped in that place. Thomas tried to back away, but his feet felt glued to the ground. The voices mixed with the sound of wailing, and then he realized the horrible truth: the mansion was a place of sacrifice. The Beaumont family had been condemned by their own sins, practicing forbidden rituals that kept them imprisoned between the world of the living and the dead. And now, with the sale of the house, Thomas's fate was sealed. Before he could react, the souls advanced toward him, their spectral arms reaching out, as if to pull him into the same abyss where they were trapped. The man who had bought the house appeared again, watching from afar, emotionless, as if this was all an inevitable process. "She needs a new guardian," the entity's voice boomed. "You sold your soul when you signed those papers, Thomas. Now you are part of this, too." Thomas screamed, but his body wouldn't respond. The cold hands of the souls gripped him, and a dense darkness engulfed his mind. He was pulled into the same fate as the Beaumont family, forever trapped in that cursed place, doomed to wander the halls of the mansion he had sold. When Thomas opened his eyes, darkness still surrounded him. It felt like a distant dream, but he knew something terrible had happened. His body was heavy, as if buried under layers of earth and dust. The silence around him was deathly, interrupted only by faint whispers, now much closer, as if they were part of him. The place he was in wasn't the basement he had seen, but a shadowy, infinite space where time didn't seem to flow. The memories slowly returned. He remembered the souls, the altar, and the spectral figures that had grabbed him. Now, Thomas was trapped, but he couldn't understand exactly where. It was as if he were inside the house itself, but Beaumont Mansion was no longer just a physical structure. It had become a place between worlds, a space where condemned souls wandered eternally. He was conscious but trapped in a state of limbo. He could feel the presence of the other souls around him, the ones he had seen in the basement, the Beaumont family and their children. Thomas couldn't see them clearly, but he knew they were there, watching him. Worse still, he felt as if part of him was becoming one of them, a soul imprisoned by the curse of that house. Time passed strangely. There were no days or nights, only the constant presence of emptiness. Thomas tried to resist. He refused to believe his fate was sealed, that he was now part of this endless cycle of horror. But the reality of the situation was overwhelming. He thought of his wife, Rachel, who was probably looking for him, unaware of what had really happened. The pain of knowing he would never see her again began to suffocate him. Yet, something inside Thomas refused to give up. He remembered all the times in his life when he had overcome difficulties, how he always found a way out, no matter how dark the situation. Determined not to succumb to this fate, he began searching for a way to escape. The challenge was monumental. To escape that place, he needed to understand how the curse worked. Remembering all the fragments of information he had gathered about the mansion and the Beaumont family, he started piecing together the puzzle. The curse had begun with Marguerite's rituals, and it was somehow tied to blood and sacrifice. The mansion was the epicenter of this cycle, and as long as it stood, it would continue drawing souls into its eternal prison. But there was hope. Thomas remembered something he had read in his studies of ancient rituals. Most occult curses had a way to be broken, as long as one understood the weak point of the magic. He needed to find the source of the curse, the thing keeping the souls trapped there. If he could destroy that, he could free himself and the other souls. The question was, where was that source? As he wandered through the dark corridors, Thomas began to hear something different. A new voice, a voice that didn't belong to the trapped souls. It was soft, almost a whisper of hope, and it seemed to guide him. He followed the sound, believing it was his only chance to escape. The more he walked, the more the mansion's presence seemed to fade. The walls and doors dissolved, and he found himself again in front of the altar in the basement, but this time, the red light that once illuminated the room was gone. And then he saw her, Marguerite Beaumont. She stood before him, her spectral figure clearer than before. Her eyes, once empty, were now filled with pain. She stared at him for a long moment, then spoke, her voice heavy with regret and sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice echoing through the walls. "I brought them here, and now I'm trapped by my own mistake. We all are." Thomas tried to speak, but the words were stifled. Marguerite stepped forward, reaching out as if to touch his face, but her translucent hands couldn't reach the physical world. She seemed to want redemption, but the curse prevented her from doing anything. She was the center of it all. She continued, "There's only one way to end this. The house is a symbol, but the real power lies in the blood. As long as Beaumont blood runs through this place, no one will escape." That's when Thomas understood. The key to breaking the curse was in the bloodline. If he destroyed what remained of the Beaumont family's legacy, he could end the curse. But that also meant he needed to find the final point of the cycle. Marguerite had been the last of the bloodline, but her actions were rooted in the very ground where the house was built. Thomas didn't have much time. The souls around him began to react, as if they knew he was close to discovering the secret. He knew he couldn't handle it all alone, so he frantically searched for something to destroy the altar, the symbol of the Beaumont family's power. But the basement was empty, except for the old furniture and the ancient symbols carved into the walls. Suddenly, the sound of wood cracking echoed through the basement, and Thomas saw a crack form in the ground, right beneath the altar. He immediately knew what he had to do. The altar was the anchor that kept the curse tied to the land. If he could destroy it, the connection to the trapped souls could be broken. With desperate effort, he used all his strength to push the altar. At first, it resisted, but slowly it began to move. As Thomas pushed, he felt the weight of the entire house bearing down on him, as if the walls were collapsing. The ground shook, and the voices grew louder, now screams of agony and rage. But he didn't stop. With one final push, the altar fell, shattering on the ground. A burst of light and sound filled the basement, throwing Thomas against the wall. The impact made him lose consciousness for a brief moment, but when he opened his eyes again, something had changed. The basement was silent. The souls had disappeared, and the oppressive presence of the mansion seemed to have lifted. He felt a strange lightness in the air, as if a great weight had been removed. Thomas stood up with difficulty, his body sore, but alive. He had broken the curse. Or so it seemed. Thomas struggled to get up, his muscles aching after the effort of toppling the altar. The silence in the basement was almost palpable, and the air, once thick and oppressive, now felt strangely calm. He had broken the altar, the central point of the curse, and the souls seemed to have vanished. However, the peace he felt lasted only a few seconds. A cold whisper echoed through the basement. It was different from all the others he had heard before. The voice didn't come from a lost soul or a spectral figure but from the house itself. Beaumont Mansion was still alive, and its presence was stronger than ever. Something was still there, something he hadn't seen. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and Thomas fell to his knees. His heart pounded hard, as if something invisible were squeezing it. Suddenly, the crack in the basement floor widened, revealing a pulsating red glow, as if the very earth were bleeding. He felt the ground tremble again, and from the hole, a dense shadow began to emerge, twisting and taking shape. It was a monstrous figure, a mix of darkness and flesh, with eyes that glowed like embers amid the mist. The essence of the curse had taken physical form, fed by centuries of sacrifices and suffering. The creature seemed to be a fusion of all the horrors that had haunted that house over the years, with multiple voices echoing in agony and rage. "You cannot escape, Thomas," the creature's voice echoed, deep and cavernous. "You freed me, but your soul still belongs to this house." Thomas backed away, fear overwhelming his body. He had destroyed the altar, but now he faced something far worse. The creature advanced slowly, its steps leaving marks on the rotting wooden floor. Around it, the walls began to distort, as if the mansion itself were alive, breathing, pulsing with dark power. The broken windows showed only darkness outside, as if the world beyond had disappeared. Desperate, Thomas looked around for something to use as a weapon, but the basement was empty. He knew he couldn't face the creature directly, but if there was any way to free himself from the curse, he needed to act fast. The monster drew closer, its deformed hands reaching out to him, its eyes burning with fury. Then, he heard a familiar sound, the faint jingle of metal. Looking around, he saw something faintly glowing in the corner of the basement. With his vision blurred by adrenaline, Thomas ran toward the object. It was an old, rusted key that he recognized from a description he had read in the Beaumont family archives. It was said there was a special key, made of iron, used to lock away something important within the house. This was the key that sealed the mansion's fate, the last link between the living world and the Beaumont family's dark secrets. Thomas gripped the key tightly, his heart racing. He knew the key was his only chance. Without hesitation, he ran toward the door leading back to the mansion's main hall. The creature pursued him, its screams of rage reverberating through the walls. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, but Thomas kept running, feeling the weight of darkness just behind him. When he finally reached the main hall, he saw the grand wooden door, the mansion's entrance, ahead of him. The key trembled in his hand as he inserted it into the ancient lock. As he turned the key, a deep, resonant click echoed through the house, as if time itself had paused for a moment. Suddenly, everything around him began to collapse. The walls of the mansion started to crack, and the ground shook violently. The creature behind Thomas let out a deafening scream, as if it knew it was about to be destroyed. The house was collapsing, as though breaking the final link had unleashed a power that could no longer be contained. Still holding the key, Thomas felt an invisible force pulling him toward the door. He glanced back for a brief moment and saw the creature being swallowed by shadows, its deformed form dissolving into nothingness. The souls that once inhabited the house seemed to be released, one by one, rising like vapor into the darkness. The oppressive presence of the mansion was finally fading. With the last of his strength, Thomas opened the door and ran outside. The moonlight shone in the sky, and the rain had stopped. He stumbled out of the property, collapsing to his knees in the muddy garden. Behind him, Beaumont Mansion crumbled entirely, piece by piece, until nothing was left but a pile of ivy-covered rubble. He had escaped, but at what cost? His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding. The mansion was destroyed, but the feeling of something dark still lingered. It was as if a part of the darkness was still inside him, a fragment of the curse he couldn't leave behind. He was free physically, but he sensed something still followed him, invisible, waiting for the right moment to claim what was left of his soul. Thomas looked up at the sky, hoping for some relief, but instead, only a feeling of emptiness filled him. He knew that while he had broken the curse, he would never truly be free. The price he had paid was too high. That night, Beaumont Mansion ceased to exist, but the echo of its curse would continue to haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. He had survived, but a part of him was lost forever, consumed by the shadows he could never escape. Days had passed since Thomas fled from Beaumont Mansion, but the feeling of having left something unfinished never left him. He was physically free, far from the house he had sold to the stranger, but his mind remained trapped. Images of the creature, the condemned souls, and the dark basement replayed endlessly in his head. There was no escaping what he had lived through. The morning after the mansion's destruction, Thomas was found in a state of shock by a neighbor, who took him to the hospital. He was diagnosed with a nervous breakdown. No explanation could be given for what had caused his collapse, and the doctors assumed it was the result of accumulated stress and financial pressure over the past few months. When Rachel, his wife, arrived at the hospital, she was devastated. The emotional distance that had grown between them over the years now seemed irrelevant in the face of Thomas's condition. She tried to speak to him, but Thomas couldn't find the right words. How could he explain what had happened? The truth was unspeakable. Who would believe that he had been pursued by a curse? After a few days of recovery, Thomas was discharged from the hospital, but something had changed in him. He was a shadow of the man he once was. His eyes, once bright and full of ambition, were now dull, lost in memories he didn't want to relive. Rachel tried everything to help, but nothing seemed to reach the depths of the trauma he carried. The nights were the worst. Thomas woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, feeling as though he was still being watched, that something, or someone, was still following him. The truth was that the mansion, though destroyed physically, still haunted him. Whatever had been trapped in that house had left a permanent mark on him. Thomas could no longer work, his real estate career crumbled. He tried returning to the office, but the simple act of entering a building made him feel suffocated, as if the walls around him were closing in. The sale he thought would save his career had, in fact, completely destroyed it. The worst came on a winter night, just weeks after he was discharged from the hospital. Rachel found Thomas standing in front of the window of their house, staring out into the yard. When she called his name, he didn't respond. He was muttering something under his breath, his hands trembling at his sides. When she got closer, she heard what he was saying, "She's here. She never left." Panic took hold of Rachel, and she tried to pull him away from the window, but Thomas seemed no longer in control of himself. That night, he disappeared. Rachel woke up the next morning to find the bed empty. There was no sign of Thomas. His car was still in the garage, and his clothes and belongings were untouched. A desperate search for him began, but no one could explain what had happened. Security cameras on the street showed no unusual movement. It was as if Thomas had evaporated, simply vanished from the face of the earth. Days turned into weeks, and Rachel was consumed by the pain of losing her husband without any explanation. Friends and family tried to comfort her, but no one knew what to say. The police opened an investigation, but with no leads, the case quickly went cold. Thomas Harding became just another name on a long list of inexplicable disappearances. The story of Beaumont Mansion began circulating again in New Orleans. Many said that Thomas had been claimed by the curse, that no one could truly escape the house, even if it had been destroyed. Others whispered that he had gone mad and fled, unable to cope with the weight of his own guilt. But the oldest residents of the city had another theory. They said Thomas hadn't just sold the house, he had sold himself. By completing the sale, he had accepted a dark fate, sealing his own end. A few months later, Rachel received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single old photograph. The image showed the Beaumont family, Marguerite, her children, and, in the background, a mysterious figure that hadn't appeared in any of the versions of the photo Thomas had found. When Rachel looked closer, her heart stopped. The figure was Thomas, dressed in clothes from another era, his expression blank, lifeless, as if he were part of that dark past. The mansion's curse had claimed its final victim. Beaumont Mansion had been destroyed, but its curse remained alive somewhere between the past and the present. Thomas had tried to escape, but the truth was that no one ever escaped the mansion. Whatever had been trapped inside wasn't just confined to the house, it was inside him now, and Thomas, like many before him, was doomed to wander forever in a place where time didn't exist, only darkness and lament. Those who pass by the mansion's old location say they can still feel a strange presence in the air. At night, some swear they hear whispers and see shadows moving where the house once stood. To everyone else, the story of Thomas Harding became just another tragic legend in the city, a grim warning that some deals come with a price that can never be paid.